Hey guys, tonight we step carefully down into a version of San Francisco most people never picture when they think of cable cars, postcard hills and expensive coffee that somehow tastes like roasted fog. You stand at street level in the years after 1906, with dust still tucked into cracks, brick, still smelling faintly of heat and damp mortar, and the city above trying very hard to look confident. Most historians agree that the earthquake and fire of April 1906 shattered huge parts of San Francisco and forced a massive rebuilding effort. But once you start looking below the sidewalks into basements, service corridors, sealed archways, and old utility cuts, the story gets a little stranger. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation,
Ready?
and
Yes,
some are
all
gentle
set.
imagination.
Let's move. Right.
Historians debate how much of what later generations thought they were seeing underground was truly unusual, and how much was just the ordinary chaos of rebuilding on a dramatic scale. You probably won't survive this, not because of the tunnels, but because walking uphill in San Francisco before modern comfort is basically a professionally administered punishment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with the version of the story that sits on the firmest ground. In the early morning of April 18th, 1906, the earth moves hard enough to turn confidence into dust. Buildings crack, streets split, water mains fail, fires follow, and the fires become almost as defining as the quake itself. What's broadly accepted is that the destruction is immense, the rebuilding fast, and the city's relationship with its own ground never quite the same again. Even before the disaster, San Francisco is not exactly built on a tidy, obedient landscape. The place is a collection of hills, dunes, coves, filled shoreline, cut slopes, and human ambition, which is a poetic way of saying that the city is trying to hold a dinner party on a staircase. Streets are graded, lots are carved, and entire sections are modified to make urban life look more orderly than nature intended. Archaeology suggests that whenever a city grows fast over complicated terrain, older levels do not vanish neatly. They linger. They hide in cellar walls, under sidewalks, behind newer foundations, in the strange little half-floors where a broom closet might once have been a doorway to daylight. That part is not especially mysterious. Cities do this all the time. They accumulate layers the way attics collect boxes nobody wants to throw away. But San Francisco has one extra ingredient: catastrophe. And catastrophe is very good at turning practical engineering into legend. As rebuilding begins, crews clear rubble, shore up what can be saved, demolish what cannot, and improvise constantly. The evidence we do have points to a city reconstructed not in one perfect sweep, but in overlapping bursts of labour, money panic, and hopeful paperwork. Plans exist, yes. Permits exist. Maps exist. But the real city is always slightly messier than the one on paper. Historians still argue whether some underground oddities later noticed in the downtown core were remnants of pre-1906 structures, post-fire repairs, street grade adjustments, or simply the result of different builders solving different problems with whatever materials and patience they had left. And patience, to be fair, was probably in short supply. Imagine standing on a street where the surface looks new enough, but a few feet below there is older brick, blackened timber, a sealed window, maybe a doorway, bricked shut because the sidewalk outside no longer sits where it once did. One interpretation is that later residents, workers, or curious explorers saw these details and felt that little shock of narrative temptation. A blocked opening looks more dramatic than a drainage revision. A buried archway feels more romantic than municipal grade change filed and approved. Nobody makes a thrilling late-night documentary called Reasonable Sidewalk Adjustment No. 12. This is where the phrase Mudflood begins to drift in from the edges of modern alternative history. To be clear, that's a possibility, not a certainty. Actually, let me rephrase that more carefully. It is a fringe idea, not a mainstream explanation. A popular rumour claims that some cities were suddenly buried by massive floods of mud, leaving lower stories submerged and whole neighbourhoods partially hidden. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because some images of old buildings do look unsettling. At first glance, windows below street-level doors opening into retaining walls, basement spaces that seem too grand to have been meant as basements. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it tells us something interesting, not necessarily about a literal mud flood, but about the emotional atmosphere of urban ruins. After 1906, San Francisco is a place where visible dislocation lingers. Ground levels change, rubble is moved, streets are repaired and sometimes raised or reshaped. Utility lines are rerouted. Temporary solutions become permanent because cities, like people, are very good at calling survival a design choice. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real mystery is not that hidden infrastructure was never meant to be seen, but that it was only meant to be seen by a very particular class of people? Labourers, inspectors, utility men, masons, and the occasional unlucky soul sent underground with a lantern and a bad back. A careful reading might suggest that invisibility is often less sinister than ordinary. The city below does not need to be secret to feel secret. It only needs to be functional. Nothing feels more forbidden than a place built for pipes. You can almost hear it now, dripping water. The scrape of boots on old brick, the metallic clink of a wrench against iron, the distant rumble overhead, where wagons once passed and later automobiles would growl and honk with modern impatience. The upper city performs itself in daylight. The lower city hums. That hum becomes one of our motifs tonight because once you notice it, it never really leaves the story. Most historians agree that San Francisco's recovery after 1906 is one of the defining urban rebuilding efforts in American history. Money flows in, architects return to drafting tables, civic pride stiffens its collar and insists it is doing just fine, thank you very much. But below that confidence there are awkward seams. Some are literal seams in masonry. Some are documentary seams where records are incomplete or too ordinary to satisfy later curiosity. And some are imaginative seams, the places where the human mind sees a bricked-up arch and begins politely inventing an empire. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. For now, the solid ground is simple enough. The 1906 disaster reshaped the city above and quite likely complicated the city below. The interpretation is that certain underground spaces later look stranger because reconstruction layered new streets, new utilities, and new assumptions over older bones. The imagined part, soft and lantern-lit, is the feeling that somewhere under the pavement behind a sealed wall, slick with age, the older city still waits, without complaint, like a forgotten tenant, listening to footsteps overhead. And as you move deeper into that thought, following the smell of damp brick and cooling dust, the question becomes less dramatic and more intriguing. Not who buried the city, but how many times a city can bury parts of itself while calling the process progress. You keep moving with that faint underground hum in your ears because once the earthquake and fire have done their work above ground. The next part of the story becomes a little less dramatic and a lot more revealing. Cities do not simply rebuild, they rearrange themselves. They trim a slope here, raise a roadway there, pour fill into a low patch, cut through an awkward rise, and then behave as though this was always the plan. San Francisco, with its steep grades, unstable soils, and habit of building enthusiasm first and explaining later, is especially talented at this. Most historians agree that long before and after 1906, San Francisco repeatedly altered its terrain to make urban life function. That means hills were cut down in some places, low areas were filled in others, and streets were graded to serve traffic drainage and construction. What's broadly accepted is that the city was never one clean, stable surface. It was a work in progress wearing a respectable hat. If you want a modern comparison, imagine trying to frost a layer cake while the cake is still arguing with gravity. The result is not just a city built once, but a city built twice and sometimes 3 times, depending on where you stand. Above ground, the newest layer presents itself as normal. Below ground, older layers remain trapped in weird half-retirement. A former first floor may become a basement. A side entrance may become a sealed rectangle of brick. A window that once looked onto a street may stare dumbly into compacted earth like it has seen too much and would rather not discuss it. One interpretation is that this repeated raising and reshaping of the urban surface is one of the main reasons later observers began to feel that parts of San Francisco were oddly buried. A careful reading might suggest there is no single mysterious event required to produce that impression. You just need time, uneven topography, ambitious engineering, and a civic culture that prefers forward motion to sentimental explanations. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Records can tell you a street was regraded. They are not always as poetic about what that felt like to the building left behind. Imagine a commercial block before the quake, its entrance level with the sidewalk, its windows catching ordinary daylight, its basement properly humble and full of the expected smells, coal damp wood, cabbage, maybe a heroic amount of moustache wax. Then imagine the same area after years of destruction, clean-up repair and infrastructure improvement. The street is altered, the curb line changes, utilities are added or rerouted, the building is repaired, modified or replaced. Now that old relationship between door wall and street is gone. A staircase appears where there was once none. A lower room feels too elaborate for storage. People decades later notice the oddity and quietly begin to narrate. That narration matters because humans are not very good at leaving an unanswered doorway alone. Archaeology suggests that in many older cities, buried architectural features often result from long-term changes in grade redevelopment and adaptation rather than one dramatic burial event. San Francisco fits that pattern in many ways, even if its version comes with extra earthquake spice. But historians still argue whether some of the lower-level spaces that survive in parts of the city are best understood as simple byproducts of urban grading, or as evidence of more irregular piecemeal rebuilding after 1906 than official stories sometimes imply. That debate is not about a lost civilization with a soundtrack. It is about process, which, if you are the kind of person who finds municipal process soothing, is actually wonderful news. And yet the strange feeling remains, because if you descend into an older lower floor and find heavy brick arches, deep-set walls and proportions that feel too dignified for a basement, your brain starts dressing the place in mystery. It's possible that many such spaces were always partly utilitarian, or were converted over time from street-level commercial use to storage or service use as grades changed. A more cautious explanation could be that the uncanny mood comes from mismatch. Human beings get unsettled when a room no longer matches the job it seems to have. A glamorous room storing crates of bolts feels like an actor doing tax paperwork. This is where the city below becomes less a hidden kingdom and more a forgotten draft. The evidence we do have points to San Francisco constantly editing itself. The waterfront is extended with fill. Roads are modified. Neighborhoods are leveled or made more accessible. Infrastructure crawls outward and downward. Some places gain retaining walls. Others gain stairways, vaults, and subgrade chambers. The surface keeps declaring progress, while the lower levels quietly remember earlier arrangements. A fringe idea proposes that such buried-looking spaces are signs of a sudden mudflood that swallowed entire stories of buildings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it does feed on a real visual phenomenon architecture that appears half-submerged. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the useful question is not, was there a secret cataclysm? But why do these places look persuasive to modern eyes? One answer may be that disaster memory and urban layering create exactly the kind of scenery that invites overconfident explanations. Fire clears. Streets rise, walls remain, photos lose context, people inherit fragments and supply drama. And to be fair, drama is much more fun than reading a municipal grading report from 1912, unless you are deeply committed to a very specific form of self-care. You can feel this doubling most clearly in the downtown core, where commercial urgency and practical rebuilding collided. A city recovering from shock has little time for philosophical tidiness. Contractors work, owners salvage what they can, new facades rise over older bones, utility systems multiply below the surface. The hum grows louder. Above, people speak the language of renewal. Below, the brick keeps older sentences to itself. Most historians agree that none of this requires a conspiracy. The city's terrain, the earthquake's damage, the fire's destruction, and the needs of a modernizing urban centre are enough to explain a great deal. But scholars continue to debate how fully the official documentation captures the improvisational reality on the ground. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it matters because cities are often rebuilt faster than they are understood. Paperwork loves neat categories, rubble does not. So when you hear that San Francisco may have been built over itself, the careful answer is yes, in the ordinary historical sense that many cities are. But in San Francisco, that ordinary process feels unusually dramatic, because the landscape is dramatic, the disaster was dramatic, and the remnants can still look like stage props from a mystery no one finished writing. What if the city below is less lost than simply forgotten in the rush above? What if buried passages are not evidence of something forbidden, but the afterimage of one city wearing another city's shoes? You keep following that idea downward past sealed thresholds and walls that no longer meet the street they were made for, and the question begins to sharpen. Not whether the city was built twice, but how mud rubble and raised roads made the second version look like it arrived with a secret. You keep that image in your mind, the city trying on another city's shoes as the ground itself becomes the next character in the story. Not the dramatic kind of character who bursts through the door waving a plot twist, but the quieter kind, the kind who keeps changing the furniture when no one is looking. San Francisco has always had a complicated relationship with its own earth. Sand dunes once shifted across parts of the peninsula. Marshy edges softened near the bay. Hills rose where planners wished they would calm down for just 5 minutes. Then came grading, filling, cutting, paving, trenching, rebuilding, and the determined belief that enough labour could talk the landscape into behaving. Most historians agree that after the 1906 earthquake and fire, vast amounts of rubble ash, broken masonry, damaged timber and disturbed soil had to be removed, reused, relocated or built over. The evidence we do have points to an enormous cleanup operation followed by years of roadwork repairs and infrastructure adjustment. This is the part of the story that sounds dull until you picture the scale of it. Entire blocks are transformed not only by what is built but by what is moved. Debris has mass, mud has memory, and once a road is raised or regraded, the spaces beside and beneath it begin to tell a different story than they told before. One interpretation is that later ideas about mudflood tunnels in San Francisco may have grown from this very ordinary but visually striking process. A careful reading might suggest that if enough rubble fill and street work accumulate in a city already famous for awkward topography, you do not need a mysterious buried civilization to explain why some lower levels suddenly feel too low. You only need practical urban change and a later generation with a flashlight and an overactive imagination. Which, to be fair, is how many good stories begin. Think of a street that survives in name but not in exact height. It may be repaired after fire damage, widened for traffic, altered for drainage, or adjusted to match a neighbouring block that now sits differently than it once did. Retaining walls appear, staircases lengthen, basement walls start carrying signs of former daylight-blocked windows, old lintels, half-swallowed arches. What's broadly accepted is that such changes happened in many parts of developing American cities, especially those rebuilding after disaster. But in San Francisco, the visual effect can feel exaggerated because the terrain and reconstruction are both unusually dramatic. Historians still argue whether every suspiciously low doorway or buried-looking facade in old photographs should be explained by grade changes alone. That debate matters because not all examples are identical. Some may reflect routine engineering, others may come from piecemeal redevelopment over decades. Some might involve partial demolition and rebuilds that preserve lower structural elements while changing the surface around them. A more cautious explanation could be that what looks like one grand mystery is actually many small practical stories stacked together so tightly they imitate a legend. And legends love mud. Not because mud is glamorous, it is not, but because mud seems alive in the imagination. It slides, settles, obscures, preserves, and insults your boots. A popular rumor claims that cities like San Francisco were buried by sudden waves of earth swallowing first floors and sealing older streets below new ones. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists partly because mud makes visual sense of what people see. If a building's lower story seems hidden, then mud feels like a satisfying villain. It is earthy, dramatic, and inconveniently hard to cross in nice shoes. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though the more useful question is whether post-disaster cleanup and road elevation could create the same impression without requiring a single cataclysmic burial event. Most historians agree that they could. The evidence we do have points to debris removal fill use and major street work across the recovering city. What we often lack is the full, neat, cinematic before and after sequence for every block. So the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A missing sequence invites imagination to stroll in wearing a detective hat. You can picture the labour itself, wagons hauling brick fragments, men with shovels and picks boots sinking into wet ground where pipes have ruptured or soil has loosened, dust settling into collars, timber stacked for salvage, streets temporarily passable in the same way a chair with one loose leg is technically still furniture. The hum from Section 1 returns here in a rougher form. Wagon wheels, distant hammering metal striking stone water, moving through freshly disturbed channels below. Rebuilding is not clean. It is a giant argument between urgency and gravity. Archaeology suggests that when urban surfaces are repeatedly altered, older circulation routes can survive in fragments below the visible city. That may mean service corridors, foundation remnants, cellar walls, drainage features, or utility-adjacent spaces that no longer align with the life above them. One interpretation is that San Francisco's so-called hidden tunnels may often be less like deliberate secret passages and more like leftover gaps between generations of use. What if the staircase leading downward feels mysterious, not because it was hidden on purpose, but because the city simply forgot to narrate it properly? There is also the matter of raised roads themselves. Roads are not just surfaces, they are political decisions, drainage systems, access routes, engineering compromises, and sometimes public performances of control. Raise a road by even a modest amount, and you change the relationship between every doorway, curb, stair, and utility entry around it. Multiply that across a damaged and rapidly rebuilding city, and suddenly the visual language of buried starts showing up everywhere. A former ground floor becomes lower than expected. A vent appears where a window once belonged. A cellar gains suspicious dignity. That dignified cellar is one of the great actors in this whole tale. It stands there with its thick brick walls and arched ceiling saying, "I was clearly meant for more than coal." Sometimes it may be right, sometimes it may simply be an old commercial lower level repurposed after the street changed. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Grandeur in a subgrade room is suggestive, not conclusive. Old builders often made utilitarian spaces stronger and more handsome than modern eyes expect, especially when masonry had to support heavy loads above. A fringe idea proposes that these spaces hint at infrastructure we were never meant to see. Remnants of a prior urban order sealed off after some abrupt event. This raises the possibility of a darker, more secretive narrative, but if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The more cautious explanation could be that infrastructure looks secret simply because it stops being legible once its surrounding context disappears. A pipe chase without its plans becomes eerie. A bricked corridor without its street becomes a rumour. And what if every staircase leading downward feels like a quiet argument with the official map? That mood is part of why the story works so well. The documented anchor is clear enough. 1906 brings destruction and massive rebuilding. The interpreted angle is that mud rubble and raised roads may have made practical changes look later, like hidden submergence. The imagined note, the soft lantern glow around the edges, is the feeling that the city below still listens when the city above speaks too loudly. You keep walking through that feeling now with damp brick on one side and fresh paving overhead, and you begin to see how an ordinary engineering response to disaster can over time start dressing itself in myth. You walk a little farther into that myth dressed in work boots, and the next thing you notice is not a tunnel exactly, but a room pretending not to be one. A lower floor, a subgrade chamber, a basement that seems to have ambitions far above its station. The ceiling is higher than you expect, the brickwork is heavier. The proportions feel almost respectable, which is a dangerous quality in a basement because it immediately tempts the imagination to start redecorating the past. Most historians agree that in older commercial districts, especially in cities that change street grades over time, buildings often ended up with awkward lower levels that no longer matched their original purpose. What's broadly accepted is that a room built near street level in one decade may become a basement in the next, if the street outside is raised, regraded, or rebuilt. In San Francisco, where the ground itself has never been especially cooperative, that process could happen in ways that later look strange. One interpretation is that these unexpectedly deep lower floors helped inspire the modern Mudflood story, not because they prove anything unusual happened, but because they look persuasive at first glance. And what if a sealed doorway at ankle height once opened onto an entirely different version of the city? That is the image that keeps returning the doorway. Not grand enough to be ceremonial, not plain enough to be ignored. Just a rectangle in old masonry, maybe bricked shut, maybe half hidden behind a later wall, maybe visible only because someone cleared a patch of plaster or peeled away decades of paint. It suggests motion. It suggests a former street. It suggests people once entered here carrying ledgers, crates, lunch pails, or ordinary Tuesday opinions. Now the same threshold sits below the current sidewalk, as if the city has quietly stepped upward and left it behind. The evidence we do have points to plenty of cases in American cities where former openings became partially buried or fully obsolete after grade changes. Archaeology suggests that these architectural mismatches are common whenever urban surfaces are repeatedly altered. But historians still argue whether all such features in San Francisco should be explained mainly by routine grading and redevelopment, or whether some lower spaces reflect more complicated rebuilding sequences after the 1906 disaster than later narratives like to admit. That is a possibility, not a certainty. The careful answer is that each building may have its own story, and buildings are not known for making things easy unless you count collapsing into a simpler shape. Imagine a storefront before the quake. The pavement outside is lower, the entry is direct. Goods move in and out. Light enters through tall windows. Then disaster strikes. Fire follows. Reconstruction. Begins the street level shifts, and the building either survives in part or is rebuilt using portions of what stood before. Years pass. The lower level remains, but its connection to the street is gone. Stairs get added. Windows become vents. Doors become scars. A later resident walks in and thinks quite reasonably, why does this basement look like it used to have better plans for its life? A more cautious explanation could be that many of these spaces were adapted rather than hidden. Once a room loses direct access to the street, it becomes useful for storage, mechanical systems, deliveries, coal maintenance, or whatever else the city needs at the moment. The room itself may still carry the proportions of its earlier purpose. That grandeur survives even after the function changes. And this mismatch between architectural style and present use is exactly the kind of thing that makes people suspect a deeper mystery. A handsome old room storing mop buckets feels like an aristocrat working a night shift. This is where the Mudflood idea finds some of its strongest visual fuel. A fringe idea proposes that lower stories like these were abruptly buried by a flood of earth or debris, leaving once normal first floors sunken beneath the modern street. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it spreads easily because the evidence is architectural rather than abstract. You can point at a half-buried window. You can stand in a room too fine for a cellar. You can find an old threshold that leads nowhere. A popular rumour claims that such features reveal infrastructure we weren't meant to see, or even the remnants of an earlier city deliberately covered over. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, though something subtler appears. Not a single hidden truth, but a puzzle made of local adjustments. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. One building may have been altered after a street was raised. Another may have kept an older, lower level through successive renovations. A third may have been reconstructed over damaged foundations, while the sidewalk outside changed height during later improvements. To modernize, these different histories can all end up looking uncannily similar. And the eye loves a pattern. You can see how that happens in your mind's lantern light. You pass one building with basement windows below grade, then another with a bricked arch, then another where a stair drops farther than expected to reach the entrance. Soon the whole district starts to feel as though it is sinking or has sunk, or was gently pressed into the earth by a giant municipal thumb. But most historians agree that patterns can emerge from ordinary urban processes when enough examples gather in one place. San Francisco's topography, rebuilding history, and infrastructure growth all make that possible without requiring a dramatic hidden event. Still, the mood is real, even if the grandest claims remain debated. Dampness collects in the lower walls. Iron fixtures rust with patient dignity. The air is cooler. Sounds from the street arrive softened, as if filtered through wool and brick. That little hum returns again, now mixed with drips and the faint memory of dust. If the city above is all sunlight and performance, the city below is paperwork and echoes. One place sells itself, the other simply continues. Scholars continue to debate how many of these lower levels were always intended as subgrade service spaces, and how many began life closer to the street. That debate matters because terminology can mislead. Call something a basement and you may assume it was always a basement, but architecture can age sideways. A ground floor can become a lower floor without changing its bones. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The room does not move, but the meaning of the room does. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if these deep basements are not evidence of a lost civilization, but of an ordinary city living through extraordinary change? That reading may be less thrilling, but it is not less haunting. In fact, it may be more haunting because it is more human. A city survives by adapting. It seals what no longer fits. It lowers one function, raises another, and leaves behind rooms that remember earlier versions of daily life. The old doorway does not need to lead into a conspiracy. It only needs to lead into a forgotten routine. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is clear enough. San Francisco changed grades, rebuilt extensively, and left behind architectural oddities. The interpretation is that these oddities helped create the visual case for later Mudflood style thinking. The imagined part is you, standing in that cool lower room, hand on old brick, feeling that you are not in a basement at all. But in a sentence, the city started writing and never quite finished. And as your eyes adjust, those rooms begin to connect in your mind with something even more expansive, not isolated cellars, but the broader underground network of pipes, ducts, vaults, conduits and service passages that could make ordinary infrastructure look like a hidden maze. And once those handsome lower rooms begin to connect in your imagination, the city below stops looking like a collection of awkward basements and starts resembling a system. Not a secret kingdom exactly, though your sleepier brain would love that, complete with cloaked surveyors and forbidden lantern maps. No, what emerges first is something much more ordinary, and because of that much more interesting infrastructure. The vast practical underbody of a modern city. Pipes, conduits, sewers, cable vaults, service corridors, retaining chambers, transit cuts, maintenance access points, and the quiet, unglamorous spaces where cities keep their lungs, veins, and nervous system out of sight. Most historians agree that as San Francisco expanded through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, its underground infrastructure became increasingly complex. Water systems, sewer lines, electrical conduits, gas lines, communication cables, and later transit-related works produced an intricate world beneath the pavement. What's broadly accepted is that much of this network grew in phases rather than as one unified master plan. One interpretation is that when later observers encountered disconnected pieces of that network without their original context, ordinary infrastructure began to feel oddly uncanny. And what if the pipes and vaults only seemed secret because they were never meant to be scenic? That is the key mood shift here. A tunnel in a story sounds romantic. A utility conduit in a municipal ledger sounds like punishment. Yet stand in the right one with bricks sweating in the cool dark and the ceiling curving overhead, and suddenly the difference does not feel so large. A service passage with enough age acquires dignity whether it asked for it or not. Add a locked iron gate, a line of old cable brackets, and the echo of water moving somewhere out of sight, and even the most practical chamber starts auditioning for folklore. The evidence we do have points to San Francisco's infrastructure evolving through necessity, improvisation, and repeated adaptation to local conditions. Hills complicated drainage. Density demanded utilities. Fires changed priorities. Reconstruction after 1906 accelerated systems that had to be repaired, upgraded, or rerouted. Historians still argue whether the underground city is best understood as a planned engineering achievement with some improvisational patches, or as a patchwork that only later acquired the appearance of a coherent labyrinth. That debate matters because the feeling of hidden order is often stronger than the actual order itself. Cities are very good at looking intentional from a distance and extremely personal up close, like a cake decorated beautifully over a kitchen that now resembles a minor legal dispute. Imagine a crew at work below street level in the years after the quake and fire. They are not discussing mysteries, they are discussing diameters, gradients, wall thickness, leakage access, and why some fool above ground keeps sending them revised instructions after the bricks are already in place. A more cautious explanation could be that many underground spaces later described as forgotten tunnels were simply maintenance or utility structures that outlived the records most people would need to understand them. Once the plans vanish from common memory, even a drain chamber can feel like evidence of a hidden age. And San Francisco gives that feeling extra help because the city's subterranean environment is rarely neat. Ground conditions vary. Earlier construction remains in place. Newer systems weave around older ones. Some routes are abandoned sealed or partially repurposed. Some spaces are enlarged. Others narrow unexpectedly, as if the tunnel itself had doubts halfway through. You can see how quickly practical infrastructure turns theatrical under those conditions. A cable vault beside an old retaining wall, a service passage intersecting older masonry, a blocked corridor that once led somewhere useful and now leads only into speculation. A fringe idea proposes that these multiplying underground spaces are not merely infrastructure, but traces of something intentionally hidden after 1906, perhaps older passageways or earlier urban systems covered over when the city above was remade. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because disconnected underground features can be visually persuasive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the better question is whether the maze-like effect results less from secrecy and more from accumulation. Build enough systems over enough decades, then seal a few and forget a few more, and you get a city whose underworks look mysterious, simply because no single person was ever meant to experience them all at once. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You may notice how often that line returns because infrastructure is one of the great engines of invisible continuity. It works best when ignored. Nobody strolls down the boulevard praising sewer gradients with tears in their eyes. Almost no one posts sentimental postcards of cable conduits. And yet remove those hidden systems, and the whole performance above ground fails immediately and with great emotional noise. So the underground city becomes invisible, not because it is secret, but because success makes it unremarkable. The better it works, the less anyone wants to think about it. That honestly is the dream of every competent plumber. Archaeology suggests that buried urban systems often survive in fragments long after their original purpose changes. A disused utility chamber may later be encountered as an inexplicable void. An old conduit path may become a sealed pocket behind later construction. A masonry sewer may outlast entire blocks of buildings above it. One interpretation is that San Francisco's rumored hidden tunnels are often best understood through that kind of layered survival. They are not necessarily one network, one plan, or one secret. They may be several generations of very practical solutions sharing walls like uneasy neighbours. But the mood remains powerful. You descend below a busy street and feel temperature drop against your skin. The smell changes to damp, brick mineral water, a trace of old oil, maybe a faint metallic tang. Sounds from the surface arrive softened and delayed. Then you see a passage branching off where you did not expect one, or a side vault closed by riveted metal, or a ladder disappearing into a service well dark enough to make your imagination put on formal wear. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the hiddenness comes not from conspiracy, but from specialization? Places built only for workers automatically feel forbidden to everyone else. Most historians agree that expanding urban utilities beneath San Francisco created a maze beneath the streets, and that later generations often encountered only fragments of it. The interpreted angle is that ordinary infrastructure can appear extraordinary when detached from context. The cinematic what-if mood is simpler and softer, a city whispering to itself through pipes and vaulted chambers, its practical organs beating quietly below the theatre of everyday life. A popular rumour claims that these underground spaces were infrastructure we weren't meant to see. That depends on what meant means. The city never exactly intended tourists to wander the cable vaults admiring brickwork and pondering metaphysics. These spaces belong to labour, not spectacle. But there is a difference between unglamorous and hidden. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Invisibility in a city is often just the byproduct of routine. The hatch is locked because it leads to work, not revelation. Still, once enough utility tunnels multiply below a rebuilding city, they create the perfect stage for later mystery. Lower rooms connect in the imagination. Old grade changes feed the sense of burial. Service corridors suggest continuities nobody fully tracks. Basements that seem too deep start feeling like entrances rather than leftovers. And from there, the next question arrives almost on its own. Not whether tunnels exist, they do in many practical forms, but whether the official plans ever quite match the lived, improvised reality underground. And that is where the paper city begins to separate from the lived one. The official San Francisco exists in diagrams, permits, engineering drawings, insurance maps, municipal reports, and the crisp confidence of men who loved straight lines on flat paper. The lived San Francisco exists in wet trenches, rushed repairs, blocked shafts, revised plans, missing pages, reused foundations, and the ancient urban tradition of saying, "We'll fix it properly later," then building an empire on top of the temporary solution. If the city below starts to feel elusive, here it is, because you are no longer just looking at tunnels or basements. You are looking at the gap between intention and reality. Most historians agree that no growing city ever matches its plans perfectly, and that is especially true after a disaster. What's broadly accepted is that San Francisco's underground systems and structural layers expanded through a mix of planning and improvisation, particularly in the years following 1906. One interpretation is that some of the mystery surrounding hidden passages or odd lower spaces comes not from concealment but from mismatch. The documents tell one tidy story, the brick tells another. And what if the real puzzle is not hidden empires, but everyday crews solving problems with brick sweat and questionable optimism? That last part may sound unfair to the crews who were in many cases performing miracles with limited time and infinite mud. But cities are built by compromises as much as by visions. A careful reading might suggest that underground San Francisco became a layered patchwork precisely because the needs of the moment rarely waited for a perfect master plan. Water had to flow, waste had to leave, streets had to reopen, buildings had to stand, transit had to move. Nobody was pausing at the edge of a trench to ask whether a curious person in the 21st century might later look at a sealed archway and start narrating a lost civilization. The evidence we do have points to repeated revisions in urban infrastructure over time. Pipes are replaced, sewers are enlarged, utility routes shift to serve new buildings or avoid old obstructions. Transit-related spaces are cut into ground that already contains earlier systems. Retaining walls alter access, lower levels get repurposed. Historians still argue whether official records can ever fully capture that kind of cumulative improvisation, especially when different agencies, private builders and contractors leave overlapping marks on the same district over decades. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but anyone who has ever tried to assemble furniture from incomplete instructions knows that reality often contains several extra pieces and one important screw missing for moral reasons. Imagine a set of plans drawn for a clean corridor carrying a utility line beneath a street. Then imagine the workers opening the ground and discovering older masonry where none was expected, softer soil to one side, a damaged pipe on the other, and a property owner above demanding that nothing disturb his business entrance or his delicate emotional ecosystem. Adjustments happen. The route bends, a chamber is widened, a side access is added, a wall is thickened. That field solution may work perfectly, but the record of it may survive only in partial notes, later revisions, or not at all in the places ordinary people ever look. Decades later, someone enters the space and thinks the odd angle must mean something extraordinary. Sometimes it does. Often it means a foreman sighed heavily in 1911 and made the best of a terrible Tuesday. Archaeology suggests that urban undergrounds frequently preserve evidence of this kind of adaptation. Plans describe intention. Built environments preserve negotiation. That distinction matters because the city below can look mysterious simply by being honest. Brickwork is less polite than paperwork. It shows where things were added, blocked, reinforced, rerouted, or abandoned. A graceful arch may suddenly meet rough infill. A corridor may narrow for no obvious reason. A sealed opening may point toward a route that once mattered and then did not. One interpretation is that San Francisco's underground acquires much of its uncanny mood from these visible moments of change. The place looks haunted, not because it is secret, but because it remembers too many edits. A fringe idea proposes that the discrepancies between plans and surviving underground spaces suggest a deliberate cover-up, as if officials documented only the acceptable city while hiding an older or stranger one below. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to anyone who has ever compared a public explanation with the weirdness of real life, and thought, politely, that cannot possibly be the whole story. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded answer may be that no large city ever has one whole story. It has districts, departments, builders, emergencies, and generations of fixes layered together until neat explanation becomes impossible. Scholars continue to debate how much improvisation defined American urban rebuilding in the early 20th century, especially in places recovering from disaster and rapid modernization. San Francisco offers a rich version of that question because its physical conditions were difficult and its ambitions were large. Most historians agree that the city's underground expanded through necessity and adaptation. The debated part is not whether changes happened, but how fully they can be reconstructed from surviving evidence. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. There is no full consensus on the complete relationship between every plan, every surviving lower space, and every later modification, and maybe that uncertainty is exactly why the place feels so compelling. A city that matches its drawings too perfectly would almost be disappointing. You would descend below street level, find everything labelled in a sensible hand, and immediately lose interest. But here the labels blur. A tunnel becomes a conduit, becomes a service passage, becomes in popular rumour a hidden route. A basement becomes a former storefront, becomes an accidental relic. The official map provides one rhythm. The underground offers syncopation. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the fascination with hidden tunnels is partly a fascination with labour itself, the invisible work that lets a city perform elegance above ground while remaining gloriously improvised underneath? The grand buildings, clean sidewalks, and civic confidence all rest on decisions made in damp places by people whose names seldom survive. The city below is not only engineering, it is evidence of maintenance, compromise, and endurance. It is where optimism puts on boots. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented anchor here is clear official plans existed, but the built city often diverged from them through adaptation and repair. The interpretation is that this divergence helps explain why San Francisco's underground can feel so uncanny when encountered in fragments. The imagined part is a lantern beam moving across brick patched in 3 different decades, each layer holding the fingerprint of a different practical emergency. A popular rumor claims that if the plans do not match the reality, then reality must have been hidden on purpose. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Mismatch does not automatically imply concealment. A more cautious explanation could be that cities are too alive to remain obedient to their drawings. What's broadly accepted is that growth, disaster, and infrastructure pressure produce exactly this kind of divergence. But once enough people encounter the divergence without the context, the ordinary messiness of urban life begins to wear the costume of conspiracy. And that costume grows even more persuasive when you start looking at the physical clues that almost anyone can notice: blocked windows, half-swallowed doorways, retaining walls, and those eerie little thresholds that seem to suggest a street once stood lower than the one you know now. And once you start noticing those physical clues, the city becomes impossible to read in only one direction. You no longer see just the storefront, the curb, the modern entrance, the clean line of the sidewalk pretending it has always been there. You begin to see interruptions: a blocked window below grade, a doorway cut off halfway by brick or soil, a retaining wall where a facade seems to have expected open air. The upper city keeps smiling for the postcard. The lower city keeps clearing its throat. Most historians agree that older districts in cities like San Francisco can preserve visible signs of changing ground levels and repeated rebuilding. The evidence we do have points to blocked openings, altered entrances, and partially swallowed lower facades in several urban environments shaped by grading, fill, and redevelopment. One interpretation is that San Francisco's buried-looking doorways became some of the strongest visual fuel for later Mudflood-style storytelling. And what if the eerie part is how a practical fix can look almost theatrical a century later? That theatrical quality matters more than it first seems. Architecture is persuasive. You can explain in calm engineering language that a street was raised, a wall retained soil, and a former entrance lost access because of urban improvements. Perfectly reasonable, entirely plausible. But put a person in front of a bricked-up archway 3 feet below the present sidewalk, and the body reacts before the mind does. Something about the image says there was once another way in. Something about it says a previous city still presses lightly against the current one, like a hand behind thin paper. A careful reading might suggest that this is not evidence of one dramatic burial event, so much as a visual habit produced by long-term change. San Francisco's terrain, its rebuilding after 1906, and its appetite for infrastructure all create situations where lower architectural features stop making immediate sense. A window becomes a vent. A doorway becomes a wall patch. A stair appears where level access once existed. Historians still argue whether every such feature should be understood through ordinary grade change and redevelopment, or whether some examples reflect more irregular episodes of damage, partial demolition, and reconstruction after the disaster. That debate is real, and it matters because not every block ages in the same way. Imagine walking along a rebuilt commercial street downtown in the years after 1906. Above you, signs are fresh, facades are repaired or replaced. Street life resumes with that particular urban confidence that says nothing bad has ever happened here, aside from all the things that obviously have. But at the base of a building, perhaps near a side alley or service area, you notice a lower row of masonry that does not quite match the rest. A faint arch line, a blocked opening, maybe even a little half moon of brickwork suggesting a former window. The building seems to have blinked and then decided not to mention it. That is where rumour begins. A fringe idea proposes that such buried doorways and lower facades mark the aftermath of a sudden mud flood that swallowed parts of the city and left only fragments visible above the new ground. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it spreads because the visual evidence feels immediate. A popular rumour claims that the entrances were not adapted over time, but abruptly buried, sealing off an older layer of urban life below. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, however, the more grounded reading may be that gradual changes can leave behind images dramatic enough to imitate catastrophe. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A sealed doorway does not come with subtitles. What's broadly accepted is that San Francisco, like many growing cities, repeatedly modified grade and access in response to practical needs. Streets had to meet each other, drainage had to work, foundations had to hold. Waterfront fill changed conditions in some zones while hilly terrain forced adjustments in others. After 1906, those pressures intensified. The city did not rebuild across a blank sheet. It rebuilt across damaged rubble, surviving walls, altered alignments, and urgent necessity. Under those circumstances, older thresholds could easily become obsolete while remaining physically present. Archaeology suggests that architectural traces often outlast the stories that once explained them. That may be why buried-looking doorways feel so strong in the imagination. They are not abstract evidence tucked away in a library drawer. They are right there in the wall, a former permission now revoked. One interpretation is that people are drawn to these features because they dramatize time itself. You can almost feel the city stepping upward while the old opening stays where it was confused but dignified, like a butler arriving at the wrong address, because the street moved without leaving a forwarding note. And then there are the retaining walls, those unsentimental slabs and brick faces that help support one level of the city against another. Nobody writes sonnets about retaining walls, which is unfair because they do a tremendous amount of emotional labor. A more cautious explanation could be that many odd lower-level architectural relationships are simply the result of retaining works added as streets were regraded or slopes stabilized. Yet to the eye, a retaining wall can look like deliberate concealment. It blocks, it interrupts, it cuts across what feels like an older logic. Put one in front of part of a building, and the whole scene starts telling spooky stories about itself. Most historians agree that these visual clues, buried windows, blocked doors, half-hidden lower facades, are exactly the kinds of remnants you would expect in a city shaped by topographic modification and repeated rebuilding. But scholars continue to debate how often later viewers overread them, especially when old photographs circulate without context. A cropped image can make a grade change look like entombment. A single facade can seem representative of a whole district when it may actually reflect a very local sequence of changes. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The clues are real, but the conclusions people build on top of them may stretch much farther than the evidence can comfortably follow. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a buried civilization, but the psychology of ruins. A blocked doorway is powerful because it offers a complete miniature plot. There was once access, there is now denial. Something changed. Human beings find that irresistible. We do not like walls that answer questions with silence. We want the explanation to be large enough to match the mood. Sometimes it is. Often it is simply urban maintenance with excellent lighting. You can almost feel the scene now in that sleepy half-light. Damp brick under your fingertips. A trace of cold in the mortar. Sound from the street arriving muted overhead. A doorway at shin height sealed with newer brick that does not quite match the older courses around it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that changing grades and rebuilding can produce exactly these features. The interpretation is that San Francisco's post-1906 environment made them unusually visible and emotionally persuasive. The imagined part is you pausing beside that bricked threshold and wondering whether somewhere in the dark on the other side the older street still remembers the shape of footsteps. And once those buried clues begin to multiply in your mind, another underground line starts pulling at the story. The transit corridors, utility cuts, and deeper engineered spaces beneath Market Street, where the city's motion above ground begins to cast a second echoing shadow below. And that shadow grows longer the moment you reach Market Street, because this is where San Francisco stops, merely hinting at an underground, and begins admitting in its own practical way that there really is one. Not a fantasy labyrinth with torches and prophecy, sadly, more a stern humming underworld of cuts, vaults, utility routes, reinforced passages and transit spaces built to keep the city moving while pretending motion is effortless. Above ground Market Street performs modernity. Below ground it keeps the machinery of that performance from falling on its face. Most historians agree that the development of transit and supporting infrastructure beneath central San Francisco transformed the city's core over time. What's broadly accepted is that streetcar systems, service spaces, utility corridors, and later transit-related construction created substantial underground environments beneath and around major routes like Market Street. One interpretation is that newer excavation and infrastructure work may occasionally have revealed older forgotten spaces or earlier structural remnants, giving the impression of a city layered more deeply than official memory tends to admit. And what if each echo beneath Market Street carries not a conspiracy, but the afterlife of older decisions nobody fully documented? That is the mood here, echoes, not revelations. The farther you go into a city's transit anatomy, the more you realize how many generations of decisions are speaking at once. One era wants smoother traffic. Another wants electric power delivered more reliably. Another wants better drainage. Another wants rail movement beneath congestion. The result is not one elegant underground thought, but a whole conversation conducted in brick, concrete, iron, and occasionally very stern bolts. A careful reading might suggest that Market Street became such a powerful focal point for underground speculation precisely because it was so heavily engineered. Where transit intensifies, excavation intensifies. Where excavation intensifies, older layers are more likely to appear, however briefly, before being sealed, again rerouted around documented badly or remembered only by workers who had dinner waiting and did not realize they were starring in future folklore. Historians still argue whether the most puzzling underground features reported near central corridors reflect genuinely forgotten spaces from earlier phases of the city, or simply the normal side effects of dense overlapping infrastructure built and rebuilt across decades. The evidence we do have points to this much. Once major urban transit systems develop, especially in a city already shaped by topography and disaster recovery, the underground becomes an active work zone rather than a passive leftover. Trenches are cut, chambers are enlarged, utility conflicts are resolved in ways that sound calm on paper and probably involved impressive levels of swearing on site. Support structures are added. Older masonry may be encountered and either removed, incorporated, or bypassed. A more cautious explanation could be that the mysterious feel of Market Street's underworld comes from this constant collision between the new and the not quite gone. And that collision is visually potent. You descend below a major thoroughfare and the temperature drops, the sound changes, the city above becomes rhythm without detail, all distant wheel noise and softened impact. Lights catch on damp surfaces. The walls may shift in material from one section to another. A polished later system may sit beside rougher older work. A side recess may seem to lead towards something no longer accessible. The hum returns again, now thicker and more mechanical, as if the city has a second heartbeat under its ribs. A fringe idea proposes that transit construction under Market Street may have crossed paths with older tunnels or hidden corridors that were never fully acknowledged in the public story of the city. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because major excavation often reveals inconvenient complexity. A popular rumor claims that crews found more than they explained, and that certain subterranean routes were sealed off rather than discussed. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more grounded interpretation may be that workers often encountered the ordinary leftovers of earlier systems. Utility chases, structural remnants, abandoned service areas, or altered foundations that later sounded far stranger when retold without technical context. That loss of context changes everything. Abandoned lateral service access sounds like something you ignore while eating lunch. Forgotten tunnel beneath Market Street sounds like a thing you whisper to your cousin at 11:47 p.m. while both of you make poor but memorable life choices. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Once a story leaves the trench and enters memory, it tends to put on a nicer coat. Most historians agree that the city centres underground became increasingly layered as transportation and utilities evolved. Scholars continue to debate how often these layers were cleanly documented versus pragmatically handled and partially forgotten. There's no full consensus on how many odd underground pockets, side spaces, or disused routes beneath major corridors were ever widely known outside specialist circles. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it matters because public memory tends to flatten complex systems into simpler myths. A transit corridor becomes a tunnel. A maintenance niche becomes a chamber. A sealed service branch becomes proof of something secret. It is a very efficient machine for producing atmospheric nonsense. But the atmosphere is not false. That is important. Just because a grand theory may be weak does not mean the feeling is imaginary. Market Street's underground really does carry the emotional charge of a layered city. Archaeology suggests that heavily worked urban corridors often preserve fragments from multiple building phases, and one interpretation is that San Francisco's central underground may have offered exactly the kind of intermittent glimpses that keep mystery alive. A worker sees older brick behind newer concrete. An inspector notes a sealed side opening. A transit dig reveals an earlier retaining form. None of this proves a hidden world. All of it nourishes the sense that the visible city rides above a crowded archive. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real fascination with tunnels under Market Street is not that they were forbidden, but that they reveal how cities think? Above ground, a city presents image, movement, commerce, confidence. Below ground, the same city reveals sequence, revision, compromise, and memory. The subway of motives, if you like, though that phrase sounds like a terrible art installation and possibly an overfunded graduate thesis. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented anchor is that transit and utility construction beneath central San Francisco created extensive underground spaces. The interpretation is that newer digs may at times have intersected older, forgotten layers, making the underground seem more secretive than it really was. The imagined part is Market Street itself at night, the street lamps above glowing through mist, while below, behind a locked service gate, old decisions continue humming in the dark. And from there, the story begins to drift outward from the center again, toward land that behaves even less obediently than downtown streets. The waterfront, the filled edges of the bay, and the uneasy ground where sinking, settling, and unstable fill can make buried architecture seem less like a theory and more like a habit. And when you leave the harder confidence of central streets and drift toward the waterfront, the whole story becomes softer underfoot in every possible sense. Downtown may give you brick vaults and the disciplined drama of engineered passageways. The bay edge gives you uncertainty, fill, settlement. Ground that behaves like it agreed to support your plans only after a long sigh and several private reservations. If the city centre feels like a machine, the waterfront feels like a negotiation with something older and moodier. Most historians agree that large parts of San Francisco's waterfront and adjacent low-lying areas were shaped by extensive filling grading and redevelopment over time. What's broadly accepted is that portions of the shoreline were not static natural ground in the modern sense, but landscapes repeatedly altered by dumping, filling construction, and urban ambition. One interpretation is that this unstable shifting ground helped encourage later mudflood style theories because buildings and street levels in such areas could settle tilt or become visually strange in ways that looked more dramatic than the underlying process. And what if the ground itself is the moodiest character in the story, shifting like it has opinions? The answer is yes. Politely, the ground absolutely has opinions, and in San Francisco those opinions are often inconvenient. A careful reading might suggest that waterfront oddities do not require a hidden cataclysm so much as a long history of working against unstable conditions. Fill can settle, ground can compact unevenly, structures can respond badly or strangely, streets can require adjustment, retaining systems can become necessary, foundations can end up telling stories that architects would have preferred to edit before publication. The evidence we do have points to generations of engineering effort aimed at making marginal or altered ground usable. That is not unique to San Francisco, but San Francisco's combination of seismic risk, coastal edges, and intense urban growth gives the whole process a particularly theatrical style. Historians still argue whether the visual impact of sinking settling and regrading in waterfront districts contributed significantly to later beliefs that parts of the city had been suddenly buried. That debate makes sense because to the eye, slow settlement and abrupt burial can sometimes create similar moods even when the underlying causes are very different. Imagine walking near the bay in the years after 1906, when recovery overlaps with long-standing efforts to shape the shoreline into something more commercially useful and physically manageable. The air tastes faintly of salt and industry. Timber piles fill material warehouse walls, rail lines and service streets all compete for space. A building sits slightly awkward in relation to the street. A lower opening seems too near the ground. Another structure appears to have sunk a little into itself. Nothing announces, "Hello, I am a case study in urban settlement." It simply looks off, and off is often all the imagination needs. A fringe idea proposes that these waterfront irregularities are signs of something more abrupt, perhaps a broad mudflood event that overwhelmed low areas and left entire lower stories hidden or half hidden. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because low-lying filled ground provides the right visual ingredients, strange elevations, partial burial, inconsistent access, and the lingering suspicion that the city is not standing on what it says it is standing on. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more cautious explanation could be that filled land naturally produces exactly the kinds of distortions that later look mysterious when divorced from engineering context. An engineering context is not always glamorous enough to survive popular retelling. Differential settlement on reclaimed shoreline does not travel through rumour with much charisma. Buried waterfront district after catastrophic mud event travels beautifully, especially if accompanied by a grainy photograph and a narrator who breathes like he just discovered Atlantis in a basement. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A photo of a building looking oddly low at the bay edge may reflect settlement grading, rebuilding, or some mix of the three. Without fuller context, the image becomes a stage where every theory gets a chance to bow. Archaeology suggests that altered coastal urban zones often preserve confusing relationships between present street levels and earlier surfaces. In such areas, one interpretation is that buried-looking spaces may reflect the cumulative effects of fill compaction, redevelopment, and foundation response, rather than one single event. That reading fits a great deal of what is broadly accepted about rapidly expanding port cities. But scholars continue to debate how well later observers, especially those outside engineering or local historical work, understood those processes when they encountered old structures below grade. There's no full consensus on how much of the city's visual uncanniness comes from actual historical complexity and how much from modern viewers misreading what the eye finds unsettling. Still, the unsettled feeling is real. The waterfront is always a place where boundaries blur. Land becomes engineered land. Shore becomes street. Water becomes commerce. Stability becomes aspiration. So when people later hear stories of buried tunnels, lost passages, or hidden infrastructure near the old edge of the city, those stories find easy soil in the imagination. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the bayfront teaches the same lesson as the basements and service corridors, only more dramatically? That urban history often looks stranger where human plans meet reluctant ground. Most historians agree that the city's expansion over altered shoreline created persistent challenges. Foundations, streets, utilities and access points all had to accommodate conditions that were never fully simple. The interpreted angle is that these unstable settings may have made buried-looking architectural features especially common or especially persuasive. The cinematic what-if mood is softer and more melancholy, warehouse walls leaning slightly into mist lower arches, dark near the tide-scented air, and the sense that the city's edge has always been half-made, half-negotiated, never fully settled in body or in memory. And once you begin to see that relationship between unstable ground and unstable storytelling, the bigger emotional shift in the tale comes into focus. The 1906 disaster does not only damage buildings and streets, it damages certainty. After something that large, memory itself becomes a reconstruction project. Stories compress, explanations harden, images lose context and gain atmosphere. A lowered doorway no longer belongs only to a building, it belongs to legend. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Disaster does not create myth out of nothing, but it gives existing oddities a louder voice. A tilted structure, a buried-looking window, a lower corridor exposed during repairs. These things become easier to fold into a larger dramatic narrative when a city already carries the memory of rupture. And that is where the next turn of the story waits, because sooner or later, the underground stops being just architecture and infrastructure and becomes something even more durable, a myth shaped by trauma. And once the story turns from ground to memory, the tunnels become more than physical spaces. They become containers for feeling. That is when the tale deepens in a different way, because the 1906 earthquake and fire do not only alter streets, walls and utility routes, they alter how the city remembers itself. Most historians agree that disasters on that scale leave behind more than destruction. They leave habits of narration. People compress chaos into story so it can be carried. They simplify, they dramatize, they turn fragments into symbols. A cracked wall becomes a warning. A survivor's route becomes legend. A buried-looking doorway becomes proof of something larger than anyone can quite explain. What's broadly accepted is that San Francisco's memory of 1906 was shaped by trauma, pride, rebuilding, and the civic need to appear resilient. One interpretation is that this emotional climate helped later generations see underground oddities, not just as engineering leftovers, but as clues to a deeper rupture in the city's past. And what if stories descend underground, because grief prefers an echo chamber with brick walls? It sounds a little poetic, perhaps too poetic for a municipal archive, but it fits the mood. After a great urban disaster, the surface is forced to recover quickly. Businesses reopen, streets are restored, public confidence is rehearsed until it becomes real enough to function. But underground, the imagination keeps looking for the parts that were never fully resolved. A careful reading might suggest that the appeal of hidden tunnels and buried spaces lies partly in this emotional split. The city above says, "We rebuilt." The city below seems to whisper, "Yes, but over what?" That whisper becomes louder as the years pass and first-hand memory recedes. Survivors age, new residents inherit stories second-hand. Photographs circulate without captions detailed enough to tame them. Local oddities survive in basements, alleys, service corridors, and odd-grade relationships. Historians still argue whether the scale of 1906's psychological impact encouraged more mythic readings of ordinary urban remnants than might otherwise have developed. That debate is difficult to settle because memory rarely leaves clean measurements. It leaves tone. It leaves emphasis. It leaves silence in suspicious places. The evidence we do have points to a city that worked hard to define 1906 as both catastrophe and rebirth. That makes sense. Public memory often prefers narratives that end with courage and reconstruction, but the underground resists clean endings. It preserves interruptions. A lower room remains below grade. A wall still bears the line of an earlier opening. A utility corridor passes through masonry older than the system it now serves. These things do not politely align themselves with official commemorative moods. They create friction, and friction is where myth likes to strike its match. A fringe idea proposes that the persistence of mudflood stories and hidden tunnel theories in San Francisco reflects more than curiosity, that it reflects an instinctive sense that the official story of recovery left something out. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it holds emotional power because large civic narratives almost always leave something out. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more cautious explanation could be that people use mystery to make room for unresolved feeling. The city healed, yes, The city modernized, yes. But odd remains, and where odd remains, story gathers. A popular rumor claims that the deepest truths of San Francisco after 1906 are literally buried, sealed away in lower corridors and forgotten chambers. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The rumor may say more about human memory than about hidden infrastructure. We are drawn to burial as a metaphor because it suggests incompleteness. Something went down, something stayed there, something was built over before it was emotionally finished. You do not need a secret civilization for that to resonate. You only need a city that endured rupture and then asked itself with admirable stubbornness to keep moving. Archaeology suggests that disaster landscapes often become myth-rich precisely because the material record is uneven. Some things vanish, some survive too vividly. One interpretation is that San Francisco's buried-looking architecture and underground spaces became attractive anchors for broader stories because they offer just enough evidence to feel substantial without ever closing the case. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the tale, it is the engine of the tale. You can feel it if you imagine a later resident descending into an old lower level beneath a rebuilt block. Perhaps the room is cool and quiet, the air touched by mineral damp, and that old metallic smell the city keeps in its hidden places. A bricked-up opening cuts across the wall. Above, through faint vibrations, the modern world passes by with total indifference. The resident is not looking at engineering drawings, they are looking at a wound that learned masonry. No wonder the mind reaches for a bigger explanation. Practical history explains function. Myth explains feeling. Most historians agree that San Francisco's identity after 1906 was shaped by both loss and reinvention. Scholars continue to debate how much of the city's later self-image depended on smoothing over the messier, more improvised realities of rebuilding. There's no full consensus on where practical memory ends and symbolic memory begins, because cities, like people, are not tidy in that way. A more cautious explanation could be that the tunnels became compelling not because they contained a hidden truth, but because they seemed to offer one. They gave people a place to project questions too large for a plaque. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if every rumor of buried infrastructure is also a rumor about time itself, about the unsettling fact that ordinary life can return above ground while the lower layers continue holding older versions of fear, labor, and confusion? The streetlights come back, the trams run, shops reopen, but below, in service corridors and old basements, the city keeps its rough draft. That rough draft matters because it makes the official version feel both true and incomplete. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented anchor is that 1906 created profound destruction, followed by determined rebuilding. The interpretation is that this emotional and physical upheaval made underground oddities especially fertile ground for later myth. The imagined part is San Francisco itself lying awake long after midnight, one half of the city sleeping above the other half listening below. And once memory hardens into myth, the next question is not just what the tunnels were, but what kinds of evidence we actually have when we go looking. Maps, photographs, cropped views, missing context, and the dangerous confidence of an image that seems to explain itself before it has earned the right. And that is where the story becomes especially modern, because now you are no longer just walking through old brick and damp service air. You are also walking through photographs, maps, reproductions, captions, missing captions, zoomed-in details, and the peculiar confidence of people staring at a 100-year-old image on a glowing screen and announcing that they have solved the whole affair before lunch. The underground city may be built from masonry, but the myth around it is often built from framing. Most historians agree that old photographs and maps are essential for understanding how San Francisco changed before and after 1906. What's broadly accepted is that images of ruined streets, altered elevations, retaining works, excavation zones, and rebuilt districts reveal a city undergoing enormous transformation. One interpretation is that when such images are isolated from their original context, they can strongly encourage dramatic readings of buried architecture and hidden infrastructure. And what if the most unsettling thing is how a cropped photograph can turn drainage work into folklore? That is not an insult to photographs. They are precious and powerful. They preserve surfaces long after the street has changed and the witnesses are gone. A careful reading might suggest that many of the most interesting questions about San Francisco's lower levels do begin with visual evidence doorways below grade windows, cut off by later sidewalks retaining walls, stair descents that seem too steep. Odd masonry transitions at street-level utility cuts exposing older forms. The problem is not the image itself. The problem is that an image is a fragment pretending with great charisma to be a whole explanation. And images are very charismatic. A ruined street seen from one angle can make an entire block look buried when it may actually be in the middle of debris clearance roadwork or local grade adjustment. A half-visible lower facade can seem like proof of sudden entombment when it may reflect gradual elevation change or rebuilding around surviving structural elements. Historians still argue whether certain widely shared photographs from post-1906 San Francisco have been overinterpreted in exactly this way, especially when circulated without the details that once grounded them in time, place, and purpose. The evidence we do have points to a city photographed intensely in the wake of disaster and throughout rebuilding. That means there is a rich visual record, but also a dangerously seductive one. Because the more images you have, the easier it becomes to cherry-pick the strangest. And the strange image, once separated from the ordinary images around it, starts behaving like evidence of a hidden pattern. One stairwell too deep becomes a district-wide theory. One bricked opening becomes a map of the invisible city. One awkward facade becomes the start of a voiceover, whispered dramatically over piano music, and suddenly the whole internet has very strong feelings about retaining walls. A more cautious explanation could be that maps create similar trouble, only more politely. Old maps are wonderful, but they capture intention, surveyed conditions, naming choices and moments in time, not permanent truth. Streets shift, shorelines are altered, lots are subdivided, access routes disappear, utility layers multiply beneath the visible surface. A map that omits a lower passage or sealed chamber does not automatically imply concealment. It may simply reflect the purpose of the map, the date of the survey, or the fact that no cartographer wants to spend 12 extra hours lovingly sketching every damp little service void under a commercial block. A fringe idea proposes that discrepancies between maps, photographs, and present-day structures suggest that parts of underground San Francisco were deliberately erased from public understanding. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives in the gaps between visual records. A popular rumor claims that if a doorway appears in one image, vanishes in another, and is missing from a later map, then officials must have buried or hidden something significant. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the grounded answer may be more mundane and more complicated. The city changed quickly. Documentation served specific purposes, and later viewers often compare unlike records as if they were made to answer the same question. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That line matters especially here because visual confidence is not the same thing as historical certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A photograph can be suggestive without being conclusive. A map can be accurate within its own terms and still leave out exactly the detail a modern mystery hunter wants most. Archaeology suggests that the best interpretation of layered urban evidence comes from combining records, not forcing one type of source to carry all the weight alone. One interpretation is that San Francisco's underground appears more enigmatic when viewed through isolated images, because the city was already physically complicated and became more so after 1906. Imagine standing over a spread of photographs on a table. One shows rubble piled high near a curb. Another shows a lower window line half swallowed by a raised street. Another captures workers in a trench exposed masonry behind them, perhaps older than the system being installed. You can feel the narrative temptation immediately. Put the images together carelessly, and they seem to narrate sudden burial. Put them together more slowly, and they may instead reveal grading, rebuilding utility work, and the ordinary chaos of a city altering itself in public view. The difference is not in the photographs alone, it is in the patience of the reader. Most historians agree that context is the key discipline here, and historians still argue whether the public appetite for mystery often outruns that discipline. That debate is not about whether the oddities are real. Many are real. The debate is about scale, cause, and interpretation. Does a buried-looking doorway speak for an entire district? Does one strange lower level indicate a single dramatic event? Does a cropped streetscape reveal a hidden past, or only conceal the less exciting parts of the same block just outside the frame? What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real lesson of these maps and photos is that urban history becomes uncanny whenever records survive unevenly? The city is not hiding because it wishes to. It is hiding because memory is partial, documentation is selective, and modern eyes are drawn to the sharpest visual clue like magpies toward a shiny moral crisis. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented anchor is that photos and maps reveal extensive post-1906 changes in grade structure and infrastructure. The interpretation is that isolated visual evidence can exaggerate the appearance of burial or secrecy. The imagined part is you hunched over a table beneath a weak lamp, tracing one old street line with your fingertip, while outside the modern city keeps moving unaware that a single cropped image has just convinced half the room it once had a second face. And once enough images begin doing that work, the broader fringe theory finally steps fully into view, the modern mudflood idea itself, less as a proven history than as a powerful storytelling frame that explains too much too quickly and yet remains strangely hard to dismiss at the level of mood. And now the fringe theory finally steps out from the mist and introduces itself properly, wearing a dramatic coat and speaking with the kind of confidence that usually belongs either to magicians or people who have misunderstood a floor plan. This is the mudflood idea, the claim, or sometimes the suggestion, that parts of older cities were suddenly buried by a vast wave or surge of mud debris or earth, leaving first floors submerged, lower windows trapped below grade, and fragments of a previous urban world sealed beneath the one we know. In online spaces, the theory has taken on a life of its own. In San Francisco, especially after 1906, it finds a ready stage. Most historians agree that mudflood belongs more to alternative history than to mainstream scholarship. What's broadly accepted is that the visible oddities people point to, sunken windows, buried-looking doorways, deep lower floors, and strange grade relationships, can usually be explained through ordinary urban processes like grading, redevelopment, fill reconstruction, and changes in street level. One interpretation is that San Francisco became a particularly strong magnet for mudflood speculation because its post-1906 rebuilding created exactly the kind of visual confusion that the theory feeds on. And what if the appeal lies less in evidence than in the dream of a reset world? That dream is worth pausing over because it helps explain why the theory sticks around even when the historical footing beneath it is shaky. A careful reading might suggest that mudflood stories are not only about architecture, they are about emotional scale. They offer a huge answer for a city that feels bigger and stranger than ordinary explanations sometimes satisfy. A buried doorway becomes more than a byproduct of grading. It becomes a clue to a suppressed event. A lower level room becomes more than an adapted former storefront. It becomes a remnant of a hidden age. The theory gives every mismatch a single dramatic grammar. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it does something very well. It unifies scattered visual puzzles into one sweeping picture. Human beings love that. We like one key that opens many locks. We like one phrase that seems to explain 10 uncomfortable details at once. And when you are staring at old masonry in a city shaped by disaster-altered terrain, filled waterfronts, shifting grades, and complex infrastructure, the promise of one clean answer can feel almost irresistible. It is the historical equivalent of finding a sweater that claims to match every outfit and then realizing much later that it mostly matches your need to stop shopping. The evidence we do have points in a different direction. San Francisco's documented history includes grade changes, topographic modification, shoreline fill, repeated rebuilding, major infrastructure growth, and the specific large-scale disruptions of the 1906 earthquake and fire. Archaeology suggests that those forces are enough to produce many of the architectural features later folded into mudflood narratives. Historians still argue whether some individual examples remain locally ambiguous, but the broader mainstream view is that no single citywide mud burial event is needed to explain the pattern. That said, the theory retains emotional power because some examples really do look uncanny. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The theory is weak as a general explanation, but the visual puzzles that feed it are often genuine. A sealed lower archway is real. A basement that feels too elegant for storage is real. A buried-looking facade in an old district is real. What is debated is not whether these things exist, but what sequence of ordinary changes produce them. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in that gap, the fringe idea flourishes. A popular rumour claims that mudflood theories are persuasive because official history refuses to acknowledge inconvenient evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more cautious explanation could be that official history is often less cinematic than people wish it to be. Mainstream accounts tend to divide responsibility among many small causes: engineering choices, shifting grades, redevelopment, infrastructure, layering, altered coastlines, and post-disaster reconstruction. That is historically plausible, but narratively rude. It refuses to give you one villain. It says the city buried parts of itself the slow way through labour and necessity, which is true enough to be unsatisfying if what you wanted was a lost civilization with excellent brickwork. Most historians agree that one reason fringe ideas persist is that they respond to real feelings of discontinuity. San Francisco does feel layered, it does feel partially rewritten. It does present visible evidence that older urban levels survive in altered form below the current city. Scholars continue to debate how best to communicate those ordinary historical processes to the public without draining away the atmosphere that makes people care in the first place. There's no full consensus on that, because your mysterious tunnel is probably a product of phased grading and infrastructure adaptation is a sentence with very poor candlelight. And yet if we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, a more interesting picture appears. The mudflood theory may not hold up as a mainstream explanation, but it points toward a real tension in cities like San Francisco, the tension between visible urban surfaces and the buried complexity beneath them. One interpretation is that the theory survives because it names in exaggerated form a truth people can feel even when they misstate it. The city is layered. Older levels do survive. Practical changes do create buried-looking spaces. Official narratives do simplify. The theory is not widely accepted, but the unease it responds to is real. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if mudflood is less a historical answer than a modern myth for living in cities we no longer fully understand? In that reading, it becomes almost poetic. Not accurate in the strict sense, but expressive. It says the modern city rests on forgotten labour, hidden systems, erased routines and levels of time we pass above without noticing. That is not proof of a secret cataclysm. It is a mood with masonry. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented anchor is that mudflood belongs to fringe theory, while San Francisco's visible oddities are broadly explainable through ordinary urban history. The interpretation is that the theory persists because the city genuinely presents confusing and atmospheric evidence to the casual observer. The imagined part is the oldest and softest a staircase descending beneath a modern block, each step carrying you not into a forbidden truth but into the layered dream of a city that never fully threw anything away. And once you understand the theory as a storytelling frame rather than a settled conclusion, another piece of the puzzle becomes clearer too: the workers who actually moved through these spaces. The maintenance crews and inspectors for whom the underground was not myth at all, but a daily route full of valves, access hatches and keys. The rest of the city never had. And once you step away from theories and back toward the people who actually opened the hatches, turned the valves, checked the conduits, and cursed softly at leaks in the dark, the whole underground shifts tone again. The mystery does not disappear, but it becomes more human, much less forbidden civilization, and much more, someone named Frank has been climbing down here every Tuesday since 1913 and would really like the rest of you to stop romanticizing the drainage chamber. The city below for most of its life belongs not to dreamers, but to workers. Most historians agree that maintenance crews, utility workers, inspectors and transit staff move through underground spaces most residents never saw. What's broadly accepted is that cities function through hidden labor, and San Francisco was no exception. One interpretation is that this ordinary exclusivity spaces, accessible only to trained workers with practical reasons to be there, helped produce the later feeling that the underground was secretive or deliberately hidden. And what if the locked hatch feels important simply because you and I are not carrying the city keys? That may sound obvious, but it matters. A place does not have to be classified to feel forbidden. It only has to exclude the general public and remain mostly invisible during daily life. The moment access narrows, imagination expands. A careful reading might suggest that much of the underground aura around San Francisco comes from exactly this relationship. Workers know the place as routine. Outsiders know it only through rumor-partial glimpses and the occasional story passed along in that half-serious tone humans use when they are not sure whether they are recounting maintenance history or accidentally inventing folklore. The evidence we do have points to many categories of labor moving below the surface over time. Sewer workers, utility crews, inspectors, transit maintenance teams, engineers, cable specialists, construction workers, opening new cuts or maintaining older ones. Their knowledge is practical and local. One corridor leads to a valve chamber, another gives access to a cable route. A lower room beneath a building may be known simply as storage relay space or old access number, longer used much, but still there if needed. Historians still argue whether the public underestimates how much hidden urban space exists simply because invisible labor is by definition easy to forget. And hidden labor leaves behind a particular kind of legend, not the grand myth of lost empires, but the smaller, tougher kind. Stories about the old passage nobody uses now. The bricked side chamber that still shows marks from an earlier system. The below-grade room where a former street-level entrance can still be traced in the wall. The utility branch that feels older than the plan on file. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories accumulate because workers routinely encounter the city's layered history in fragments, then pass that knowledge along informally rather than ceremonially. Cities are full of oral tradition wearing coveralls. A fringe idea proposes that the people who worked underground knew far more about hidden tunnels than officials ever admitted, and that much of San Francisco's buried infrastructure was quietly managed rather than publicly explained. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers because workers often do know things the broader public does not. That is not sinister. It is just division of labor. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded interpretation may be that specialized knowledge always feels like secrecy from the outside. The man with the ring of keys does not need to be part of a cover-up. He merely needs to know which corridor floods when it rains. What's broadly accepted is that most city residents only encounter infrastructure at the moment it fails. A pipe bursts, a street is dug up, a manhole opens, a service door stands ajar, and suddenly the hidden world flashes briefly into view before disappearing again. That intermittent visibility is powerful. Archaeology suggests that partial exposure tends to intensify mystery, especially in layered urban settings. One interpretation is that the city below felt more dramatic, precisely because people saw it only in fragments, a worker emerging from a hatch, an old tunnel mentioned in passing, a utility vault glimpsed during roadwork, a basement room with suspiciously grand brickwork discovered during renovation. And from fragments the mind builds castles, or in this case damp corridors with slightly too much symbolic significance. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A worker's recollection of a sealed side passage may be accurate, incomplete, exaggerated, or all three at once. A maintenance route may incorporate older structural remnants without anyone ever bothering to narrate that fact in a way historians later find satisfying. Most historians agree that underground systems frequently outlive the neat documentation that first accompanied them. Scholars continue to debate how much valuable local knowledge vanished whenever systems were modernized, departments reorganized, or practical traditions passed from worker to worker without ever becoming polished public history. Imagine a city inspector descending with a lamp in the early 20th century. He is not seeking revelation, he is checking condition, access, and function. But along the way, he passes a bricked opening whose outline suggests a former route. He notes a chamber that appears older than the adjacent line. He steps from one material vocabulary into another, newer concrete here, older brick there, patched mortar in between. To him, these are observations. To later ears, they become clues. That transformation from observation to clue is one of the quiet engines of this whole story. A popular rumor claims that crews found infrastructure we weren't meant to see, as though the underground were designed to keep the truth hidden. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Infrastructure was not built for public viewing, which is different from being built to conceal history. The practical city has no obligation to explain itself beautifully. It needs to work. It needs to survive weather, pressure, load, and time. If an old corridor remains behind a wall because no one has reason to remove it, that may feel mysterious later, but a practical mind sees only unused space with sentimental brick. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real divide is not between official truth and hidden truth, but between narrated space and unnarrated space? Above ground, a city is constantly described, advertised, mapped, celebrated, complained about, photographed. Below ground, a city is mostly used. That difference alone can make the underground feel haunted by omission. Not because someone erased it, but because almost nobody ever thought to tell its story while it was busy doing its job. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented anchor is that maintenance workers, inspectors, and utility crews routinely used underground spaces the public did not see. The interpretation is that this limited access helped make those spaces feel more secretive than they really were. The imagined part is simple and soft, a worker's key turning in an iron lock beneath a city block. At dusk, the hatch lifting warm street noise above cool darkness below, and a whole hidden routine beginning without witness. And once you see the underground through the eyes of those workers, the final shape of the mystery changes. The question is no longer whether the tunnels are real in some dramatic sense. It becomes what the tunnel's basements, vaults, and buried thresholds actually suggest about San Francisco itself, about rebuilding adaptation records myth, and the peculiar human habit of mistaking complex history for a single buried secret. And with that key turning in the dark, the shape of the whole puzzle becomes easier to hold without squeezing it into something too simple. The tunnels are real in the practical sense. The buried-looking thresholds are real. The lowered rooms, sealed openings, altered grades, filled shoreline, patched masonry transit cuts, and utility corridors are all real enough to leave dust on your fingers. What changes now is not the evidence, but the question you ask of it. Most historians agree that urban layers usually tell stories of rebuilding adaptation and infrastructure rather than one single hidden event. One interpretation is that San Francisco's underground remains compelling because the city's records, materials, and memories do not line up neatly. And what if the truth is more human and therefore more haunting? That is the turn here. A careful reading might suggest that the most durable explanation is also the least theatrical at first glance. San Francisco buried parts of itself the ordinary way, through grading, through reconstruction, through shoreline fill, through transit expansion, through utility growth, through disaster response, through the everyday civic instinct to make the next version work, even if the last version is still quietly sitting underneath, wondering why no one has come back for the furniture. This is not a disappointing answer, unless you require your history to arrive wearing a cape. The evidence we do have points to a city repeatedly rewritten by its terrain and its emergencies. What's broadly accepted is that 1906 was a massive rupture, but not the only force at work. San Francisco had already been altering its landscape for decades, and it continued doing so afterward. That means any given odd underground feature may belong to several overlapping stories at once. A buried doorway might reflect a raised street. A deep lower room might be a former commercial level repurposed after grade change. A sealed corridor might be an old service route abandoned during utility modernization. Historians still argue whether the public appetite for one sweeping explanation has overshadowed the much richer reality that cities usually change through accumulation rather than a single dramatic act. And accumulation leaves a different emotional trace than catastrophe. Catastrophe is loud and decisive. Accumulation is patient. It layers small, practical choices until the end result looks uncanny to those who did not watch it happen. That is perhaps why San Francisco's underground feels so persuasive as a mystery. The city's visible oddities do not look like the products of paperwork labor crews retaining walls and utility diagrams. They look like scenes. A room too grand for storage, an archway bricked shut below sidewalk level, a stair descending farther than reason seems to expect, a side chamber behind a locked service door. These are perfect theatrical fragments, but theatre is not the same as conspiracy. A fringe idea proposes that because the fragments look so dramatic, they must belong to a larger concealed truth, a buried district, a suppressed event, an older infrastructure intentionally hidden after 1906. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because fragments are emotionally greedy. They ask to be completed. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded interpretation may be that the underground feels more coherent in imagination than it ever was in practice. Different remnants from different decades get recruited into one story because human beings hate a loose end and love a dramatic hallway. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That sentence has been walking beside us the whole time, and here it matters most. We know San Francisco rebuilt after devastation. We know it changed grades, filled land, expanded infrastructure, and left behind visible clues of earlier configurations. We know workers moved through underground spaces that most residents never saw. We know photographs and maps can isolate those clues and make them feel bigger than their immediate context. What we cannot fully confirm in many cases is the exact chain of alterations behind every single lower-level oddity. That gap is not evidence of a hidden empire. It is evidence that cities are messy archives. Archaeology suggests that the best way to read such archives is to resist the temptation of one grand key. One interpretation is that San Francisco's underground teaches precisely that discipline. It asks you to hold several truths at once. Most historians agree that the city's lower spaces are broadly explicable through ordinary urban history. At the same time, scholars continue to debate the details of specific sites, specific grade relationships, and specific sequences of rebuilding. There's no full consensus on every local mystery, and that is not failure. It is simply what honest history looks like when the ground has been moved, built over damaged, repaired, and narrated by generations with different priorities. And maybe that is why the story keeps humming after midnight. Because the honest version is stranger than the simplified one. The honest version says the city below is not a secret waiting to be exposed all at once. It is a chorus of practical leftovers, altered meanings, and half-visible former lives. The lower city is where adaptation becomes architecture. A basement remembers being a storefront. A sealed window remembers daylight. A utility corridor cuts through older fabric and accidentally preserves it. A street above claims finality, while the materials below quietly disagree. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real fascination lies not in hidden truth, but in layered time? You are not just looking at structures. You are looking at time refusing to leave the building. Modern life likes clean surfaces and quick summaries, but cities, especially old and overworked cities, are not summary friendly. They keep receipts in brick. They store revisions underground. They let one century lean against another until a worker with a key or a renovator with a flashlight suddenly discovers that the present is standing on a very crowded shelf. A popular rumor claims that the tunnels prove the city is hiding something monumental. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The tunnels may instead suggest something more ordinary and more profound, that urban life always hides most of itself in order to function. The hidden part is not necessarily scandal, it is support, maintenance, adaptation, compromise. The city survives by letting the visible world take credit, while the invisible world does the heavy lifting. That is not a cover-up, that is Tuesday. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented anchor is that buried-looking features and underground systems in San Francisco largely fit known patterns of grading reconstruction fill and infrastructure growth. The interpretation is that the mystery remains strong because records are uneven and urban change is cumulative. The imagined part is you standing very still beneath a block of the city, hearing the softened pulse of traffic above, knowing that nothing down here needs to be supernatural to feel uncanny. And once you accept that the final movement of the story becomes almost restful, the city no longer asks you to choose between official history and wild theory. It asks for something calmer to keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and to let both exist without forcing either one to pretend it is the whole sky. And so you arrive at the gentlest answer the story can offer, which is not really an answer at all, but a way of holding the city without forcing it to confess to something it never promised to explain. Most historians agree that buried structures in old cities usually result from ordinary processes: grading fill reconstruction, changing access, new infrastructure laid across older forms. Archaeology suggests that San Francisco fits that pattern in many ways, even if it wears the pattern with unusual drama. One interpretation is that the underground became a stage for modern myth-making precisely because the visible clues are real, while the complete chain of explanation is not always close at hand. And what if the final lesson is not that history hid from us, but that cities always leave a little of themselves half asleep below? That may be the most honest place to stop. Not with a reveal, not with a dramatic verdict, but with a layered picture. The earthquake and fire of 1906 were real and transformative. The rebuilding that followed was real and vast. Streets changed, grades shifted, fill accumulated, transit expanded, utility systems multiplied. Lower rooms lost their original meanings. Doorways were sealed. Windows sank below sightlines. Workers carried keys into spaces the public never knew by name. What's broadly accepted is that all of this is enough to produce the underground strangeness people still notice today. Historians still argue whether some individual sites remain more complicated than the standard explanations capture. That debate is fair. Cities are local, specific, and stubborn. One block may tell a slightly different story from the next. A more cautious explanation could be that San Francisco's underground does not yield one perfect narrative, because it was never made by one event or one plan. It was made by repeated human decisions under pressure, and pressure is not known for leaving tidy memoirs. A fringe idea proposes that the city below preserves evidence of a more abrupt burial or concealment than mainstream history allows. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it still performs a useful function. It reminds us that the visible city is never the whole city. A popular rumor claims that the tunnels are infrastructure we weren't meant to see. Let me rephrase that more carefully. They are infrastructure most people were never expected to need. That difference matters. The hiddenness is practical before it is symbolic. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and that is all right. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is strong enough. San Francisco is a city repeatedly built, damaged, repaired, regraded, and adapted across difficult terrain and unstable edges. The mist is softer and maybe more human. The feeling that old rooms remember daylight, that sealed thresholds remember footsteps, that the lower city still holds unfinished sentences from earlier versions of ordinary life. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if it is simply reminding you that every city depends on forgotten labor and hidden layers, and that modern surfaces are always standing on older arrangements they no longer bother to name? That reading may be less thrilling than a buried secret, but it lingers longer. It lets the tunnels remain what they are: practical, partial atmospheric and deeply suggestive without having to become a single grand revelation. And now the pace can soften, the brick cools, the hum grows distant. Above ground, the city continues with its lights, its late cars, its restless little ambitions, and below the older spaces remain patient. You do not need to solve them tonight. You only need to sit for a moment with the idea that cities survive by layering themselves, and that some of those layers stay near enough to touch while others recede into memory rumour and the quiet dark underfoot. So you let the tunnel go dim in your mind, you let the old doorway stay closed, you let the stairs descend only as far as they want to. The air is cool there and still and faintly mineral, with that trace of iron and damp stone that belongs to places built for function rather than display. Somewhere above, tyres pass over pavement that once sat lower or higher or differently enough that a room below still carries the shape of another year. Somewhere a sealed window keeps its last geometry of daylight. Somewhere a worker long gone closes a hatch in memory and leaves the keys hanging where only the city can reach them. And as the streets settle into silence, you let San Francisco become what it perhaps has always been best at being: not a solved riddle, not a hidden empire, but a layered place where survival looks like reinvention and where the past does not vanish so much as drift gently downward, resting beneath the present like a second, quieter breath. You do not have to chase it anymore. You can simply listen. The traffic fades, the hum softens, the brick holds its cool. The older city, whatever remains of it, asks for nothing now except to be left in peace, half remembered and half dreamed, under the sleeping weight of the streets above.